Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Fanny Widley was born in the city of Nottingham in England around 1854. Tragically, her mother died when she was 4 years old. Her father, named John, worked hard, but did not live in good circumstances. So in 1864, he took his family to start a new life in America. It was a good time to move to America, as following the end of the Civil War in 1865, the economy grew and there was much work, especially in manufacturing. Fanny found employment in a factory. Although only 10 years old, she had done similar work in Nottingham. It was a good position for her. The factory was a short distance from her home, and the area housed many families who had come to New York for work. Her father, however, knew that she should be educated, so she studied in the evenings and attended school on Sundays. She was a polite and charming girl, and as she grew up, displayed all the virtues that were considered correct for a young lady in the latter part of the 19th century. She also grew up to be very attractive, but despite receiving the attention of young men, Fanny never went out. She would just work, study, and help her father. She worked for a lace manufacturer named John Marr. He found her to be a very industrious worker, as well as friendly and popular amongst her colleagues. However, in February 1869, when she was 15 years old, she took up a position in a factory that manufactured hairnets, owned by a gentleman named George W. Watson. Mr. Watson was 45 years old and married with 5 children, 4 girls and a boy. His business was located in a building that housed other businesses on 1st and South 11th Streets in the Williamsburg neighborhood of New York. He only had a few employees, but he had prospered in recent years due to the increase in demand for hairnets. Mr. Watson knew that Fanny was a diligent and hard-working young lady from a respectable family who were not fortunate enough to live in the best of circumstances. He would sometimes call at her house to give her instructions for the following day, but his visits were not those of a caring employer checking on one of his employees. Mr. George Watson had far more sinister intentions. After 5 months of starting work in the factory, Mr. Watson asked Fanny to see him in his office. She was unsure why he would want to see her, but when she entered the room, he made inappropriate approaches towards her. Fanny reminded Mr. Watson that this was not the conduct of a gentleman, but he told her that if she did not give in to his advances, she would be dismissed from his employment. Worried about her family, and in the knowledge that it was difficult to find work without reference, she succumbed to his demands. Over the next few months, Mr. Watson would seek her out at every opportunity. Things became difficult for Fanny. Ashamed that her employer had taken her virtue, she moved from her father's house and took up lodgings closer to her work. After living in 1 or 2 places, she went to live in the residence of a lady named Mrs. Woodhouse. Fanny, however, was unable to escape her tormentor. He also had lodgings in New York, as his home was over 100 miles away in Hartford, Connecticut, so he too took a room in the home of Mrs. Woodhouse. Eventually, Fanny realised that she was with child. She told Mr. Watson, but he was not overly concerned. Instead, he gave her a bottle and told her that if she drank the contents, it would sort out her condition. Fanny did as he said, and the effects brought on a miscarriage. The anxiety of this ordeal and the uneasiness she felt by constantly being pursued by her employer had an adverse effect on her health. She lost weight, her face became gaunt, and she seemed to be far more withdrawn. She was certainly no longer the happy, vivacious young lady she once was. At her lodgings, she would speak to a gentleman named Henry Hyde. He was a widower and a similar age to Mr. Watson. Despite the difference in ages, Fanny and Henry started courting. She found him to be a very pleasant and agreeable gentleman, and after a few months, he proposed. During the time that Henry and Fanny had been seen out together, Mr. Watson had told her that if she got married, he would no longer pursue her. He had even sworn this to be true by placing his hand on the Holy Bible. By now she was desperate to rid herself of the insufferable Mr. Watson, and as Henry was a most charming gentleman, she accepted his proposal. Soon after, Miss Fanny Widley became Mrs. Fanny Hyde. Mr. George Watson, however, did not keep his promise, and within just a few days of Fanny getting married, he started to seek her out and follow her around in the factory. She would remind him that she was no longer single and that he had promised to leave her alone once she became a married woman, but her words had little effect. A few weeks later, Fanny found herself back in Mr. Watson's office. He accused her of being a bad woman and going off with young gentlemen who worked in the same building. She told him that everything he said was untrue, but Mr. Watson was persistent, and Fanny was soon in the same situation as before. She was very worried and decided that she must tell her husband. Mr. Henry Hyde was an honourable gentleman. He was, however, someone without influence. Nevertheless, he would not allow Mr. Watson to disrespect his wife, so he confronted him and said that he was going to inform the law about what he had been doing. Mr. Watson begged him that he did not do this. He said that it would cause great distress to his wife and children, and he again gave his word that he would desist from his pursuit of Mrs. Hyde. For a few months, Mr. Watson's behaviour towards Mrs. Fanny Hyde improved. Some of the time, he would stay at his home in Connecticut, only occasionally coming to the factory. When he did, he would always look at Fanny, but did not ask her into his office. Somewhat inevitably, however, he was unable to keep his promise, and after a while, his dishonourable conduct continued. Fanny told him that she would again tell her husband, but Mr. Watson replied, but if she did, he would inform her father and everyone she knew that she was a young lady with low morals who had seduced a respectable married man into an improper relationship. In January 1872, with the help of her brother, Fanny purchased a pistol. She had intended to give it to her husband as a present. There had been some robberies in the area, and Henry was concerned that they were not protected if anyone should break into the house. On Thursday, the 25th of January, Mr. Watson again asked Fanny into his office. By now she had had enough of his torment. It was a regular occurrence, and very much unwanted. Suddenly, she had an idea, but the pistol she had purchased could have other uses. It was small enough for her to conceal on her person, and she considered that if Mr. Watson would again try to dishonour her, she could threaten him with it. Fanny had never previously shot a pistol, but thought just having it would be enough to persuade him to desist from his actions. The following day, Fanny went to the factory, determined that Mr. Watson would not insist that she pays a visit to his office. She hid the pistol in her dress. It was a regular day. The machines, as usual, made a lot of noise, making it difficult for everyone to hear each other. It was very cold outside, and the staff were working very hard making the hairnets. Again, Mr. Watson called Fanny into his office. She entered the room, but this time she refused his advances and left. He followed her into the stairway, accusing her of being a woman of low morals, who would sleep with men other than her husband, and asked why she would now refuse him. The language he used was very inappropriate, especially when directed at a respectable married lady. Fanny turned. She looked straight at Mr. Watson. She then took out the pistol from her dress and fired one shot. He fell to the floor. Shaking, Fanny looked at him. She had shot Mr. Watson in the head, and she realised that he was dead. A lady named Mary Decker heard the shot and came to the stairs. She saw Mr. Watson lying motionless on the floor. A few minutes later, she saw Fanny sobbing. She asked her what was the matter, and Fanny replied that Mr. Watson had been the ruination of her and that she had shot him. Fanny then left the building. A few hours later, accompanied by her father, husband and brother, she went to the 5th Precinct Police Station and told the sergeant on duty that she had shot and killed Mr. Watson. After taking down her statement and confirming that Mr. George Watson was indeed deceased, Fanny Hyde was charged with murder. The trial of Fanny Hyde began on the 15th of April 1872 and was headline news. The whole of New York seemed fascinated with the case. A young married lady had shot and killed her employer. It was an easy case for the prosecution. Fanny Hyde was not even denying that she had fired the pistol. Fanny's lawyers did not see the case as such a one-sided affair and constructed a solid defence. They argued that Mr. Watson had been a seducer of innocent young ladies, robbing them of their virtue. They told the court of how Fanny had lost weight, became pregnant, and with the prospect of losing her job and having her reputation dishonoured, she gave in to the gentleman's demands. This left her worried and anxious and affected her mind. They informed the courts that her family had a history of mental illness, as her grandfather had taken his own life by drowning himself while suffering from temporary insanity. They claimed that the torment that Fanny had endured over the previous 3 years had resulted in her suffering with the same condition. Many witnesses were called, and each day the newspapers were filled with events from the trial. Mr. Watson's widow, named Eliza, told the court that they had been married for 18 years, and that her husband was the kindest and best of men. Witnesses for the defence told of how Fanny was a modest young lady, always bright and cheerful, and someone who conducted herself in a modest manner. They added that she had not been herself for a good while, had lost weight, and always seemed anxious. At 2:30 p.m. on the 19th of April, the proceedings ended, and the jury was sent out to deliberate. 8 hours later, they requested that they be informed as to the definitions of the offences: murder in the first degree, manslaughter in the third degree, and justifiable homicide. Although these provisions of the law had been explained during the course of the trial, the judge sent them precise definitions. The explanations may have resolved a few concerns for the jury, but the 12 men were unable to agree upon a verdict. The judge brought the jury back into court at midnight, but the foreman informed him that they were still unable to find a verdict, to which they all agreed. Again, the judge sent them back and asked them to discuss the case further. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the jury came back into court, and the foreman stated that there was no possibility of an agreement. The judge then discharged them. It was later revealed that 10 jurors had found the defendant not guilty on all charges, and the other 2 thought her guilty of manslaughter in the third degree. Fanny Hyde was released on bail, and a new trial date was set for January 1873. Fanny, however, failed to attend court. In March of the same year, she was arrested and put in prison to await a new trial date. Somewhat strangely, she was again released on bail 6 months later. However, she never faced another trial, as before her trial date was set, Fanny Hyde disappeared. What happened to her after her release remains a mystery. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case